The day I learned silence can set off alarms was the day my boss pretended I didn't exist. No org chart, no headshot, no seat at the all-hands where they clapped for people who renamed folders. Me? I was the scaffolding they built their victory slides on. The code, the logic, the checks that made our numbers more than pretty fonts. That was me. Jesse, filed 2 shells deep under a vendor agreement so boring it could sedate a rhino. I wasn't hired to play politics. I was hired to keep us honest. Our company, Verloon Systems, had one promise to banks. We tie your lending criteria to real, auditable performance. No surprises. Sounds glamorous until you realize a single careless directive can turn that promise into a legal bonfire. That's why I embedded tripwires, tiny, boring, lawful things, inside the platform's compliance spine. Not a bomb, a conscience. If someone yanked out a credential wrong, the system didn't explode. It documented. And it alerted the bank liaison who slept with one eye open. I did all of this from a wobbly kitchen table with a chipped mug and a plant the color of expensive regret. Quietly, reliably. While other people chased titles, I chased clarity. I was fine being the ghost. Ghosts see everything. Enter Nolan, my new boss, a man who wore ambition like cologne. He wasn't cruel in the cinematic way. He was worse, impatient with the truth. He measured value in dashboards and volume. If you could say it louder, it must be right. He called my team backline operational overhead, which is corporate for I don't read, I skim. He loved a purge. New era, new energy, he announced in a meeting I wasn't invited to. He started cleaning up contractors because retaining knowledge is harder than deleting accounts. The irony? I wasn't on his books. Marcus, our CFO, had kept me under the compliance cost center, neat and defendable. Marcus had the slow, careful voice of a person who'd actually met a regulator. He once told me, "Your code is the seatbelt no one brags about until the crash." We understood each other. Then Marcus went on medical leave. No warning. Just gone. A gap where a guardrail used to be. Nolan bloomed. He added himself to channels, asked performative questions, and demanded impact slides from people who shipped fixes while he slept. He started probing cost centers, eyes lighting up at anything labeled vendor. Someone must have told him I was that contractor in compliance. He never said my name. He called me the module. The message arrived late in the week. No greeting, no signature, just, your access will be reviewed. Prepare justification. The word review wore a smile that meant goodbye. I've been through 6 reorganizations. I knew the scent of a decision pretending to be a question. I didn't argue. I documented. Every pull request, every change log, every policy note with my initials tucked at the bottom like a watermark. Not dramatic. Just the paper trail people forget to respect until it's the only thing with a pulse. Then came the meeting. "You're done here," Nolan said, leaning back like the chair owed him money. "Delete all your codes and files from your laptop. They're company property." He slid a printed memo across the table. Signed, dated, gleaming with overconfidence. He had the grin of a man who thought I, T, and truth were synonyms. I read it once. No raised voice. No lecture on Clause 12 regarding offboarding procedures and credential transfer. Just one sentence from me. "Do you mind putting that directive in writing with your signature?" He tapped the memo. Already did. I folded it, slipped it into my bag, and nodded. He expected begging or tears. I gave him silence. Silence makes certain men hear themselves for the first time. Back at my kitchen table, the plant looked even more exhausted than I felt. I opened my terminal. I followed Nolan's instructions to the letter. I deleted my local repo. I removed my tools. I wiped cached docs. No secret copies. No backdoor zip files. No accidental backups. Because contrary to office folklore, integrity isn't a mood. It's a method. But here's what Nolan didn't understand. My laptop wasn't the system. The system was the system. And the system had a memory. Identity flags, validation hooks, a credential anchor tied to offboarding protocol. None of it malicious. All of it approved by Marcus. Months earlier, precisely because real life gets messy and people get sloppy. When they do, the code is supposed to say, "Hold on. Show your work." An hour later, I closed the lid and poured tea that tasted like cardboard. A Slack window blinked on my phone. Friends who couldn't mention my name on company channels sending careful sideways condolences. "He called you legacy overhead," one wrote. "Also, the metrics dashboard is acting weird. Probably nothing." Probably nothing is how a lot of preventable disasters introduce themselves. Somewhere inside our platform, a small light turned red. A deletion had been detected that didn't match the offboarding sequence. The credential anchor with my signature had vanished without paperwork, handoff logs, or revocation trail. It didn't throw sparks. It filed an affidavit. And somewhere else, a different light blinked. At a bank portal run by a person who'd heard too many fairy tales from companies like ours. That portal didn't care about Nolan's memos. It cared about compliance chains. It saw a missing link where a link had been required. It did exactly what it had been told to do months ago. Pause, escalate, request assurance. I didn't touch a thing. I didn't need to. Nolan strutted into the boardroom like it was a stage he'd finally earned. Chest high, jaw set, memo ready. He had no idea the room had shifted 3 degrees colder. He didn't see Marcus's name pop up on the screen, the way legal's faces looked carved from stone. He didn't hear the phone call before the meeting started, or how the air tightened after someone said, "Freeze." He only heard it when the CFO's voice, calm, surgical, cut through the carpeted quiet. "Just got a call from the bank. Tell me exactly what you told her to do." I didn't answer right away. I didn't have to. I wasn't in that boardroom, but I could picture it. Nolan with his practiced smirk, the CFO with that quiet stare people develop from years of watching mistakes cost millions. A silence so heavy it makes people confess more than they intend. Meanwhile, I sat at my kitchen table, fingers curled around a chipped mug of tea gone cold. The message threads kept pinging. "What happened?" "They said you're gone, is that true?" My friends typed with the caution of people who didn't want their messages discovered later. I didn't reply. Sometimes silence is more informative than words. What Nolan didn't know, and what I didn't have to tell him, was that Marcus had built the scaffolding with me. We didn't design it to be flashy. No one claps for compliance. We built it to be incorruptible. Every credential tied to the platform carried a history, an attribution chain, a trail that couldn't be erased without consequence. That memo Nolan signed? It was already a contradiction. He'd instructed me to delete all codes and files while still credentialed to a live compliance system, which meant the moment my credential performed an unauthorized deletion, the system would log it as an irregularity. And when irregularities touched compliance logic, the bank didn't ask nicely. They escalated, automatically. I imagined Nolan answering the CFO with that fake confidence of his. "She was just a contractor," he'd say. "I asked her to remove her local files, standard practice." He probably didn't realize that words like just and contractor don't erase responsibility when you're on record. See, I've lived through enough reorganizations to know how this plays out. People think authority lives in memos and titles, but real authority lives in systems, in protocols, in the paper trails that don't care if your suit is tailored or your voice carries. Authority lives where accountability is baked in. And that's exactly where Nolan had decided to take a shortcut. I didn't gloat. Not then. Instead, I opened the secure drive Marcus and I had set up months earlier, a just-in-case vault. Inside, encrypted documentation, signed protocols, the kind of boring files no one thinks about until they're worth more than gold. My initials were there, stamped across diagrams, logic flows, approval notes. The system didn't just have my code, it had my fingerprint. That's when the first call came. Not to me, of course, but to one of my colleagues who liked to whisper. "They're asking about your credential flag," he said later, voice hushed as though someone could overhear through the phone. The bank flagged the deletion event. Legal's in a panic, I didn't say much. Just listened. Because I knew this wasn't about revenge, this was about trust. Banks don't extend millions in conditional credit lines without ironclad assurance. Our company's promise wasn't innovation or speed, it was integrity. And when you mess with integrity, you don't get second chances. By then, Nolan must have started sweating. Maybe he repeated his line about me being overhead. Maybe he tried to make it sound small, manageable. She was working on back-end stuff, nothing critical. I could almost hear it, the way his voice would rise just slightly at the end. A tell he didn't know he had. But the CFO wasn't the type to be soothed by volume. He would have asked for logs. Legal would have pulled them up. And there it would be, clean and irrefutable. My credential ID, timestamp deletion, no corresponding offboarding record, no revocation ticket, no compliance officer approval. Just Nolan's memo. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the plant I still hadn't watered in days. There's a kind of calm that comes when you know the system itself is speaking louder than you ever could. I didn't need to write a dramatic email or storm into an office. I'd already done my part months ago when I insisted the system needed those safeguards. The irony? Nolan thought firing me was erasing me. What he actually did was spotlight me. You can ignore a ghost when it's quiet. But when the ghost is written into the foundation of the building, erasing it makes the whole place shudder. Another message pinged. This one from a QA engineer who had always been too nervous to even make eye contact in meetings. He's trying to spin it, the message said. Said you over-engineered everything, but the CFO just asked if he personally authorized the deletion. He stammered. Everyone saw I smiled then, but not with joy. More like recognition. I'd seen men like Nolan before. So sure shortcuts would make them legends, so blind to the fact that shortcuts always leave tracks. Tracks that compliance people like me are trained to follow. Back in that boardroom, I imagined the CFO lowering his voice, asking again, slower this time. Tell me exactly what you told her to do. And Nolan, cornered, repeating himself, not realizing every word was digging him deeper. The truth wasn't complicated. It rarely is. He'd told me to delete everything. And I had. Exactly as instructed. Now the system was asking the same question the CFO had. Only the system wasn't going to accept spin for an answer. And that was only the beginning. By the next morning, the whispers had turned into noise. I didn't need to log into company Slack to know the temperature had shifted. My phone buzzed with vague texts from people who'd never dared to contact me outside of work hours. Are you okay? One wrote. He's blaming you. Another added. Blaming me for what, exactly? Doing what he told me to do? Deleting my local files? It was almost funny. Almost. What Nolan never understood is that when you work in compliance systems, every action is both an instruction and a confession. The system doesn't forget. It doesn't care about charisma or a chain of command. It cares about sequence, documentation, proof. That's why I had built it that way. That's why Marcus had approved it. Later that morning, my phone buzzed again. This time from a number I didn't recognize. The message was short. Did he tell you to delete it? No greeting, no context. Just that one line. Marcus. It had to be him. No one else asked questions like scalpels. I didn't type an answer. Instead, I opened my bag and pulled out the memo Nolan had so generously signed. Black ink on white paper, his name scrawled at the bottom. Time-stamped. I scanned it, encrypted the file, and forwarded it to the secure channel Marcus and I had used back when he still trusted me with keys nobody else knew existed. 5 minutes later, a Dropbox folder appeared in that channel. Inside were contracts, change logs, the architecture documents I thought had been archived into oblivion. He had kept them quietly, even after HR scrubbed me from the books. That was Marcus. Always cautious. Always leaving breadcrumbs. And just like that, the story stopped being about me. It became about the memo. From what I heard later, the CFO had placed it flat on the boardroom table. blinds half drawn against the morning sun. Everyone in the room leaned forward as if the page itself was radioactive. He ordered the contractor to erase system-critical files. The CFO said, not loud, not theatrical, just precise. While still credentialed. While still tied to our compliance trust chain, nobody spoke. Then the compliance officer, a woman named Tara, who rarely raised her voice, said the only words that mattered. That's grounds for breach classification. The room went silent again. The kind of silence where people start to realize their careers may have just bent in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, Nolan was still doing what men like him always do when the walls start to creak. He postured. He told anyone who would listen that I was just a contractor, that my work wasn't mission critical. He repeated it so often it sounded like he was trying to hypnotize himself. But words don't erase logs. By midday, the bank had frozen the company's revolving credit line. Not revoked, not canceled, just frozen. Like a parent taking away the car keys after hearing a crash from the garage. $18.5 million, locked until someone could prove the system still had integrity. I didn't need to gloat. I just brewed another cup of tea and watched the steam curl into nothing. What Nolan didn't know was that his memo was already doing the work for me. The moment he put pen to paper, he created evidence of his directive. Evidence that directly violated 3 clauses of the vendor agreement Marcus had filed years ago. He thought he was erasing me, but all he had done was write me back into the story, this time as proof. That afternoon, a friend from QA called, voice trembling with both fear and glee. Julie. She still called me by my first name, though no one else at the company dared. He's cornered. Legal's tearing through the logs. They can't find a single offboarding ticket for you. No credential transfer. Nothing. Just his memo I didn't reply right away. I let her talk. She needed to get it out. Finally, I said, that's all they'll need. Because here's the thing. In corporate dramas, villains like Nolan always imagine the big showdown will be someone yelling across a table. But in reality, it's a piece of paper, a line of code, a time-stamped log. Quiet evidence that doesn't flinch when confronted. That evening, I opened the secure drive again, staring at the memo glowing on my screen. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was something colder, heavier, like gravity pressing down. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about inevitability. The bank wanted documentation. Legal wanted answers. And Nolan? Nolan had already provided both. He just didn't realize yet that the memo he handed me wasn't a shield. It was a blade. And it was already cutting. By Monday morning, the storm had a name. They were calling it the containment phase. It sounded clinical, harmless even, like something a doctor would say before handing you antibiotics. But inside Verloon Systems, containment meant one thing. Nolan was no longer trusted. I wasn't in the building, but word traveled fast. Colleagues texted me in fragments, each piece painting a clearer picture than the last. He's locked out of Slack. Legal has him in a conference room. Marcus is back. Marcus, back earlier than anyone expected. No memo, no announcement. He just walked into the building at 8 sharp, thin from treatment but steady, sleeves rolled. The kind of presence that made people lower their voices without realizing why. The first words he supposedly spoke weren't greetings. They were a question. Why is Jesse's credential showing an irregular termination event? That question landed like a hammer. Because there was no good answer. The logs were clean, time-stamped, my ID tied to a deletion that hadn't followed protocol. And Nolan's memo, his pride, his proof, was the only instruction tied to it. When pressed, Nolan did what men like him always do. He doubled down. She was a contractor. She had no ownership of the platform. He said it again and again as though repetition could turn it into truth. But ownership wasn't the issue. Integrity was. And the system didn't care if I was full-time, part-time, or ghost. My signature was baked into the compliance scaffolding. The bank's trust chain ran through it. Removing me without a proper handoff wasn't just sloppy. It was negligent. Legal dissected everything. They didn't raise their voices. They whispered, passed papers across the table, highlighted clauses. Each missing log, each absent approval, each skipped step was another cut. By the time they were finished, Nolan's defenses looked less like an explanation and more like a confession. I pictured him sitting there, sweat pooling under his starch-collared shirt, repeating, "Just a contractor," while the walls leaned in. Meanwhile, I sat at home with my cat sprawled across the printer, laptop closed. I hadn't touched a line of code since the deletion. I didn't need to. The system was speaking for me louder and cleaner than I ever could. Every failed integrity check, every flagged anomaly, it was my testimony. Automated. Indisputable. Around mid-morning, Marcus sent me a single-line email. "Did you keep the memo?" I replied with the scanned copy, encrypted and time-stamped. His read receipt came through almost instantly. Later, a QA engineer called me, giddy in a way that only comes when fear gives way to relief. "Jesse," she said, "they read his memo out loud in the room." Tara, the compliance officer, looked up and said, "That's breach-level negligence." He went pale. Like, completely white, I didn't laugh. Not because it wasn't satisfying, but because it was heavier than that. There's nothing funny about someone gambling with systems people trust to hold millions. By noon, the board had been looped in. Investors wanted answers. The bank demanded assurance. And Nolan? He was suspended from all platform operations, pending compliance investigation. It was the kind of phrase that sounds neat on paper, but in reality means your career just got sealed in a plastic bag. Security escorted him out before he could even return to his desk. No farewell speeches, no dramatic outburst. Just a man in a suit walking between two guards while the office pretended not to watch. I got another text from a colleague minutes later. He looked straight ahead. Didn't even blink. I poured myself another cup of tea. Let the silence fill the room. This wasn't revenge. This was gravity. A cause followed by its effect. Still, I couldn't help but think about how easily it could have gone differently. If Marcus hadn't come back early, if I hadn't scanned the memo, if the system hadn't been built to scream when tampered with, all those safeguards, the seatbelt no one brags about until the crash. That night, Marcus called. His voice was tired but calm. "The bank wants you to validate the system. One-time credential, just verification. Nothing more," I said, only one word. "Understood." After we hung up, I sat in the dim light of my apartment, tea cooling by my hand, cat breathing slow beside me. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Not triumph, not vindication, just the quiet knowledge that the system had worked exactly as it was meant to. And Nolan? He had learned what happens when you swing an axe at a ghost without checking what the ghost is holding up. The access link arrived as a single line from Marcus. One-time credential, restoration scope, audit visibility on. No flourish, no apology. That's how he respected people, by trusting their work. I booted a clean terminal, the kind that sounds like a hospital room when it first wakes up, and stepped back into a system that still knew my name even if the company tried to forget it. I didn't touch anything I wasn't authorized to touch. Real life isn't a movie where heroes smash keyboards and save the day in neon light. Real life is method. I ran integrity checks, compared hashes, followed the same checklist I'd written months earlier when coffee tasted less like duty. The failures lined up exactly where they should have. The credential anchor, the compliance hooks, the audit loop. It wasn't catastrophic. It was protective. A seatbelt locked after a sudden stop. I pulled a lawful template from my encrypted store. My property, not theirs. Architecture, not IP. Think of it like a blueprint I drew on my own time that tells you where the beams go but doesn't bring any wood. I slotted it against their live structure, made sure every joint had a corresponding approval, then triggered the validator. The logs cleared one by one, slow and quiet, like a house exhaling after the wind passes. The bank's portal ticked from amber to green. No confetti. No applause. Just a single confirmation line and a space to attach notes. I wrote the only sentence that mattered. System behaved as designed under unauthorized deletion directive. Integrity restored following verified remediation. Then I logged out. No victory lap. Just a clean exit. My phone lit up seconds later. Marcus. "It's stable," he said. A statement, not a question. I could hear conversation murmuring around him, the soft panic of senior people relearning humility. "Jesse, thank you." There was a pause, the kind you don't fill out of respect. Finally, I said, "It didn't fail. It worked." He exhaled. "I know." The rest moved quickly in that slow corporate way. Legal opened a folder labeled Findings. Nolan's memo sat on top like a paperweight made of regret. Words like negligence and policy breach appeared in emails that used to praise speed and boldness. The board chose language that sounded neutral but wasn't. The bank sent a polite, surgical note. Assurance received. Monitoring continues. People asked if I wanted to come back full-time. A desk, a title, a headshot, a chair at the table. It sounded tempting for about 30 seconds. The promise of visibility after years as a ghost. Then I remembered the look on too many faces when they realized the system had a conscience. They didn't want me. They wanted the feeling of safety my work bought them. Those are not the same thing. I asked for something else. A contract addendum that recognized architecture stewardship as part of risk management, with direct reporting to compliance instead of operations. No performance decks, no vanity metrics. I wanted a line in legal English that said, essentially, when she says stop, we stop. If they wanted my name in the foundation, they needed to sign it into the building permit. Marcus read it. Legal marked it up. I marked it back. We settled on language that didn't make anyone a hero, just accountable. That's what grown-up systems ask for. Clarity, not worship. I never saw Nolan again. Word was he resigned to pursue new opportunities. People wrote soft messages about chapters closing and lessons learned. No one wrote the real thing. That the fastest way to break trust is to treat it like a speed bump. He'll land somewhere. Men like him always do, until they don't. What I remember most from those days isn't the bank or the freeze or the memo that bled. It's the messages from quietly good people. The engineer who said, "Your checklist saved my weekend." The analyst who whispered, "I thought I was crazy for wanting documentation." The junior dev who typed, "I learned more from your comments than from any training." They were the reason I built guardrails in the first place. Not to catch villains, but to keep ordinary people from being dragged into someone else's shortcut. If you're still watching, if you do work that rarely gets clapped for, listen, you don't need a cape. You need a paper trail. You need boundaries written in places where bluster can't erase them. You need to read what you're signing, and you need other people to read it too. The drama ends up in boardrooms. The truth lives in logs. Marcus texted me a week later. We're naming the validator after its function. Integrity Cascade. Your initials are in the spec. I stared at the message for a long second. Not because I needed the credit, but because names are how we keep stories straight when memory gets political. I replied with a thumbs up. The most emotional I allowed myself to be at work. That night, I sat at the same kitchen table, tea ring haloing the mug, laptop shut for once. The plant looked less terminal. My cat snored like a tiny chainsaw. I felt something gentle. Call it relief or just the absence of dread. The company would spin, the board would message, the bank would monitor. Life would normalize into whatever companies call normal after a scare. As for me, I kept my terms simple. I would remain a contractor. I would keep my distance. I would keep the blueprint, the checklist, the anchors. I would keep the right to say no, written somewhere ink can't be heat-treated away. There's a temptation, after a story like this, to declare victory. To say justice was done and the bad guy got walked out between two polite men in security blazers. But the truth is quieter. Justice, when it shows up at all, looks like a green light on a dashboard and a signed clause in an agreement. It looks like a system that refuses to forget. I lifted my mug and said it out loud. For anyone who ever sat unseen at a kitchen table keeping the lights on for people who don't know where the breaker is. Build it honest. Make it fail safe. And make them sign.